What's up, everybody? We are back. John Delarose here, the leading Hispanic voice in science fiction. Actually, in the office for once. Wow, it's kind of crazy. But gonna do a review today. I don't have my tripod on me, so we're gonna have a shaky cam that I'm holding and deal with it, just like the good old days of the reviews here on this channel. And today we got Tales of the Batman by Archie Goodwin. Now, Archie Goodwin is a longtime DC writer and editor, you know, obviously going back to the 70s and before, as he did with the tales in here. And the reason I picked this up is because my pal Chuck Dixon keeps telling me that Archie Goodwin is the best comic writer of all time. And so I picked up some of the eerie work he did, and I saw this online. Now, this is of DC's hardcover line. They do Tales of the Batman by different writers, and then they have a line for artists also that basically cover pre-crisis stuff. And I think they cover all of the writers' work within the volumes. Gary Conway has 2 or 3 volumes of his, for example. But Archie Goodwin's, I believe, is complete. I don't know. I don't know a lot of pre-crisis DC, but it skips around in issues. So, you know, I mean, it is an artist or writer-centric collection, so you're not going to get a lot of stuff. But the good news is a lot of those pre-crisis stories didn't have a lot of like continuing stories and things like that in them, so you really don't need that as much. Get a dust jacket, hardcover, very nice, thick, heavy book, which is good to read. And it covers just some random stuff. Detective Comics 437, 438, 440, 142. We get this Manhunter special edition, which these ran as backups in Detective Comics around the time that the first ones did. And then there's a conclusion one. And I found that pretty neat because Walter Simonson actually drew all of the art in those. We get a couple Batman black and white issues, Showcase 95, number 11, an annual story, and Legends of the Dark Knight storyline that was going on, Siege, and then Batman Night Cries, a graphic novel at the end. And the first stories are very interesting, and these are just like straight up detective stories, and Batman has to like figure something out that's going on with him, and very Scooby-Doo type of stuff. He figures out the ending, and there you go. And these are just one-offs, and Batman does his thing. There's not really much of a like supporting cast or background. They're very short comics. They're like 12 pages each. And Batman solves the mystery. Very classic stuff, very enjoyable. And I haven't read a lot of pre-crisis Batman stuff, but I would say just setting up the crimes and criminals, setting up what's going on in these different short stories here. Archie Goodwin does do a great job. This was a fun one where they actually dealt with a World War I air show sort of scenario where, you know, you thought it was one criminal, but it turned out to be somebody else who actually was the problem with things. And the guy that they were going after originally was a perfect example of like a red herring in a lot of ways. But he actually was intending on doing something bad. He just didn't do it, and Batman's like, well, now you know not to do crime, and the guy's like, yeah, and he changes his way. Pretty cute. But I think this really shines with Manhunter, and this is one of the coolest stories I've ever read. And at first I was like, why is this in the Batman thing? I know it's a backup to Detective Comics, but it's about this guy who was killed and then resurrected, and he was supposed to be a spy for this organization. Oh my gosh, I got pages sticking together. This sucks. Ah, I'm going to put my foot. All right. And we learn about the organization, and they're out to change the world, but then they decide they're going to overstep in the way they change the world. I love Walt Simonson's art in this. This is, I mean, those DC ones at the beginning had some decent artists on it, but those were very just generic DC house style from the time period. This really shines. Walt Simonson does a wonderful job. I always love his art, though. He's not as stylized as when he gets with Thor or Ragnarok just yet, but you can still tell the beginnings of his style here. Just look at the shading on this right here. Very interesting stuff, and creates such a cool scene. And through these storylines, Manhunter deals with this gal from Interpol who eventually she learns about who he is and everything going on with him. And so therefore she ends up on his side, and they deal with that little secret society together and start fighting, and eventually take down most of the stuff. At the end of it, it looks like Manhunter dies, but there's like this clone army of Manhunter. Finally, Batman does get involved, and that's when we see things. At the end of it, I guess they kind of brought that into the Bat universe. And Batman is, not wanting to kill, of course, and then he's wanting to kill. So there's the conflict there between characters and the styles of doing things. Eventually, Manhunter disappears and looks like he's dead. And then we get a final chapter, which was drawn and written much later for whatever this volume of Manhunter was, also by Simonson and Archie Goodwin. And as you can see, his style evolved, and he just became an even better artist. This is just wonderful comic art right here. I just love the scene. I love this little perspective view of the neighborhood with the police lights and all that. Very cool. And this one actually has no dialogue as it goes all the way through it. So it's quite a different read than the rest. And we find out that there's these Manhunter clones that are being hunted down to get rid of them because they're part of this evil secret society basically at the end. Very cool. Very cool little backup. And then they add a little page from the old story to see how it ties in. So even though the story really ended in the last one, this is a nice little coda to the series, and this was worth the book and the read all by itself. If you can track down a version of this storyline, I think it's in another trade paperback it mentions at the beginning, totally worth it. I love the hardcover, of course, and this is super out of print. I should mention this. Of course, right? I found this on eBay as part of like a 2-for-3 deal, and so I got it on the cheap, and it was awesome, and there we go. The annual story is also maybe the next best story in here, and I believe this is from the late 80s or early 90s. And we have a situation where Batman deals with these ninjas and this black guy who gets caught up with these ninjas. And this was a really touching story, and it gets into his daughter, and I really enjoyed this. I thought this was some of the funnest, coolest. I love these background characters. I'd love to see more of these ninjas. And it's a pretty long story, so you get a nice feel for all the characters. Batman's fighting with no weapon, and you see how strong and awesome Batman is by just like stopping the blade. Very cool, very dynamic. What an excellent moment. So love this. It only kind of gets better for a while. So Manhunter and that were probably the best in here. We get another this showcase story is just dealing with somebody in Arkham, which was okay. Those were probably the best two in the book. Of course, like I said, the Walt Simonson art is just great. And then that annual just had a wonderful dynamic story with the background characters being very cool. Some Jim Lee art on the Batman back in black and white. We get an interesting story about a character who has this like evil trumpet sort of thing, and this feels like an old eerie story where like the trumpet really takes him over a little bit, and then he ends up getting rid of it. Doesn't have a ton to do with Batman, but it is what it is. I like the black and white art also. I think this is pretty neat stuff. The little Alex Toth drawing right here, which makes me happy. Also, so beautiful art. This one has to do with like this blimp. Look at this stuff. Look at this. Wow. That is just like amazing line work right there. Very cool stuff. Very detailed and very cool. And that's worth a read right there. But those are short stories. Real quick again. Then we get into this Siege storyline. And the Siege storyline is about this mercenary colonel who basically has this history with the Waynes and tells his people there's gold under the Wayne Manor, basically, that they're going to steal. It as a spoiler. You don't learn that till later. And they get into there, and it turns out he just wants to blow it up and just like really screw the Waynes and doesn't even care, and even betrays his mercenaries at the end. But he's a tactical genius, and Batman has to deal with the tactical genius throughout this entire thing. I like at the beginning that each of these chapters starts with this little crusading art. It's pretty cool. And of course, that ties into the theme of Batman as the Caped Crusader. And we learn a lot about this. Bruce Wayne's in a spot right here where he's actually trying to work out of a office building downtown and built a new place there, and is trying to move away from Wayne Manor. And I don't know. I don't like this art style quite as much. I think some of the figures are a little stilted by Marshall Rogers here compared to, say, the stuff we were just reading. And I think these colors are a little bit on the flat side for this time period also, which is the early 2000s. But tells a pretty interesting tale. It builds up very well, and I enjoyed this also. This storyline wasn't quite as good as those early ones, but there was a lot of like history Batman in there with Thomas Wayne and the whole Wayne family going back generations. And so this to me feels like the prototype Scott Snyder storyline. Scott Snyder goes into the history of Gotham and all that stuff very deeply into his storylines. This one is like the granddaddy of that from 20 years ago. Archie Goodwin really did it first, and honestly, I think did it a little better, because I think where Snyder fails in the writing is he gets really bogged down in that world building and it slows the stories down. Archie Goodwin puts it as a background, and you learn a lot of interesting details of that background, but he keeps the pace going very well, and we end up with Bruce Wayne and this woman having a little issue here. Now, the last story is a very weird one, and this is that graphic novel I mentioned, and you get this like early 90s experimental photo art that's kind of digitized, which I really like. Back in the 90s when I was a kid and I saw this stuff coming out, I was like, wow, this kind of stuff is really neat. But now I actually hate reading this kind of art in comic books. So it's really dark. This is a very drastic change from the rest of the series. And there's child abuse in it, and it's really sad. And Batman has to deal with this. And it just I didn't feel good reading this one, and I did not like this story whatsoever. Now, I get he was trying to make a point about child abuse in it, and that's the whole point of the story. But man, this did not have the feel of the rest of the Batman stuff in here. And I wish it wasn't in here, comparatively. So ended on a big down note for me. Like I said, I don't like this art style. I don't think it's dynamic. I think it's kind of boring to read. And I feel like it just does not convey the range of motion that regular comics do. And so all the way around this story, after reading all that brilliant stuff, I was just kind of let down by the final story in here. And it ends on just this negative note, and Commissioner Gordon and his wife are fighting, and it's just dark and edgy, and I just hate that kind of thing in comic books. So that's that. So you get a mixed bag in here, of course. I liked the beginning okay with those short stories, which were just kind of one-offs, fun stuff, and you kind of just get the feel of that old school Batman, that Scooby-Doo Adam West style. Then you get into the longer stories, and with Manhunter was amazing, and some of the best comics I ever read right there. And the annual was good, the black and whites were good, Siege was good, and then you get the end that was a very drastic style change. But it does show Archie Goodwin has a breadth of style he can do. He can do anything. He can do that Adam West style. He can do the Manhunter serial, which is really just is a complete action, grips you. He can do a cool character-based story. He can do the historical Batman. He can do the horror, dark nihilism thing. He can do everything. And so as who is Archie Goodwin and what is his writing, this is actually a great compilation. So you can, even if I don't like one of the stories just because of the style, the craft is not bad in it, right? We gotta separate the two things of what's my taste and what the craft is. So overall, this is well worth the read. Probably a 9 out of 10 for comic books. This is great comic book history. I kind of want to get these other Tales of the Batman. Like I said, I haven't read much pre-crisis Batman stuff. And I know they have a Steve Englehart one, and I like his work a lot. Gary Conway stuff, which, he's hit and miss. And it'd be nice to get those. This is the hardest one to find of the group. So good luck finding this if you're looking for it, but it is awesome. So check it out, and we will be back soon. Hit the like and subscribe button. We appreciate your readership. Have you read any of these stories? Especially the Manhunter. I want to hear people who are into Manhunter. Now, I talked to Chuck Dixon after reading this, and he always said that, like, you know, DC Editorial had like this like special relationship with certain characters. Like Manhunter was one, The Questions one, and they would just reserve those characters and not allow you to touch them unless you're like a Mark Millar or a Grant Morrison or something like that. And he found that frustrating while he was working there, because it's like he wants to work with characters like that. And because they're always on reserve, they actually don't become bigger characters because they're not seen in the public eye as much. So it kind of has a catch-22 element to the characters and how they don't grow and become some of the more popular characters. Very interesting analysis on that front. Just that's a side note, but I'll end the video with that, I guess. See you guys soon.